Edmonton slide, but I don't.
There we go.
Do we have anybody? Oh, and do you know what the registration numbers are?
There was 35 registered, which jumped up quite a bit from yesterday. So usually it's about half that we get in, and half the people just need the recording later, kind of thing. So
okay, that's really good. It's not like a hot AI topic, Jared, but
it's just an overview.
Yeah, but there's people that really want to know.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the curiosity is astounding. Yeah, and I would say later in an email too, but just so you guys know, I'm always happy to do like a follow-up presentation that's more specific to kind of something that's come out of this presentation or whatever the case may be.
Okay. Yeah. How do I say your last name again?
Bielby.
Bielby. Okay. It's kind of a silent E then.
Yeah, it's old Norse. Vikings.
Well, we're actually doing phonetic spellings for the counselors.
Okay.
Because they don't want to be embarrassed in front of the public.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, it's happened many times. I'll be referred to as Bielby or all sorts of different pronunciations. I don't mind so much, but it's good just to set the record straight.
Where are we at, Troy?
11 so far in here.
Hi, everybody that's joined us. My name is Donna. I'm with ARMA Edmonton chapter. If you don't mind posting in the chat your name and where you're from, and if you have any particular questions or interest in this topic that Jared can know about as he's doing the topic, let us know. And we'll get underway shortly.
Another minute or two.
We just have a few people coming in and we will be underway shortly. Hi, Anne. Nice to see that you're from Seashelt. Oh, Carolyn, thanks for joining us. I know you're on my board with me from ARMA Edmonton chapter. Oh, hi, Jesse. Great to have you with us from Denver. Very much a presenter. Oh, Lewis, I'm glad you're here from Ottawa. Hello, Pat from New Brunswick. Oh, we've got some really lots of ARMA support here today. So for those that missed my announcement just as we were about to get underway here, if you'd like to post your name and where you're from, and if you have any particular questions that you'd like him to address, our speaker to address, just put them in the chat today and we'll just carry on from them. Hi, Vera, nice to have you with us from ARMA Edmonton chapter. So we're just getting a few more people in. Karen, it's nice to see you again from Greenview. I know you've been coming out to our ARMA events. Hi, Carol from Winnipeg. Okay. So maybe what we'll do is we'll actually get underway, Troy. So my name is Donna Malloy. I'm a board member with ARMA Edmonton chapter. Normally you see Rick Sterling from Western IM kick this off, but he has an appointment today. So I get to fill in for Rick, which is extremely large shoes to fill, almost impossible shoes to fill. But I'm with the ARMA Edmonton board, and this is part of our webinar series to support IMCanadaConnect, which is what IMCC stands for. And we are having what is a very interesting talk today by something I'd never even heard of before, which is a data ethicist. Jared Bielby is our speaker and presenter today. He currently works for the City of Edmonton as an information ethicist. And it was interesting to talk to him about his background in getting in this field because he actually has a background in both computers and library science. So it's an interesting way to get into the field, and I'm really excited for this presentation, which I have never even seen a presentation on this topic before. So without a lot of further introduction, I'm going to turn the floor over to Jared. He has about a 50-minute talk, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. But I also think that if you have questions as we go along, please post them in the chat, and then we can handle them at the end. Or if they're totally related to what he's talking about, he might just take them at the time. Very flexible here. So without a lot of further talk, Jared, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Donna. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining me today. It's a special honor to be able to bring a presentation like this to one of the groups who I consider to be founding of the foundational field in itself, of where I eventually, and others like me, spanned out from library and information sciences and records management and computers to create this new field of information ethics. And so I kind of feel like a presentation like this to this type of group is in a way returning home. And so I very much appreciate the opportunity. And just for further context, I guess, to build off of what Donna was saying, it is an interesting kind of collaboration. What this field of information ethics, or data ethics, as it's now called, because it did start out in the 1980s. Academics will even argue that it started out in the 1950s with cybernetics, but definitely in the 1980s, where technology became more and more a part of our lives as information professionals, and the need for considering some of these questions of ethics arose simultaneously in both library and information sciences and computer sciences. And it wasn't until about maybe a decade into it where both these fields realized that they're dealing with and coming out with solutions for the exact same issues in a new way, coming from completely different backgrounds. And it's easy now to look at computers and libraries and say, yeah, I can see the resemblance. But back then, we didn't just assume that it was the same thing. And yet the marriage of the two became what is now known as, originally as, information ethics. And so when I present, I do kind of come at it as information ethics, but you'll hear all sorts of commentary, whether we work in corporate or industry or government, on data ethics right now. And so you won't hear anything about information ethics, you'll hear data ethics. And then, of course, more recently, AI ethics, right? And it changes because, everybody wants to jump on board with the newest thing and the sexiest sounding name, right? And so, it goes through these phases. Information ethics became cyber ethics, became a few different iterations, digital ethics, until most common now it's referred to as AI ethics, because everything is going down the road of AI. But at a corporate level, working with cities and government, we still use data ethics as our platform. The bottom line is it's all the same issues, the same background, same history, and the same way moving forward, even though we can't predict right now where AI is going, and it's a scary thought. We do know that the issues are going to be exactly the same as they've always been. And so there is that comfort, and it is kind of a guiding principle for our field. So with that, I'll get started here. Just a quick overview about about the direction I'm going to take here, about some of the questions that Donna wanted me to kind of specifically gear my speech around. Kind of as an agenda here, I'm going to start out with answering the question, why is this important to you? What do you need to know? How does information ethics or data ethics impact your job as an information or records management professional? And ultimately, starting from the very basics, we won't go back to Socrates, but we're going to kind of start at the very basics of what ethics, from a Western point of view at least, is, and how it's progressed over the thousands of years, and then how that has become data ethics or information ethics. How it impacts your work, we'll touch on that, and I don't get into specifics about record management so much. I can certainly do that if you had specific questions later on, but more in general, how it might relate to your organization or any organization dealing with information, and then ultimately leave you with a direction for further research if you're interested. And so with that, I'm going to jump in with a couple of definitions here to give you an idea, high level, but still an idea of what this is in an applied sense. And so information ethics is a branch of applied ethics. It focuses on the moral principles guiding the creation, use, and impact of information technology, particularly at the personal and social levels. It examines the ethical implications of how information is produced, distributed, accessed, and utilized, as well as the impact of technologies on individuals and society. So pretty simple, although high level. I also have here a data ethics definition. Let's see if there's any notable differences or what the similarities may be. I think we'll find that it's more or less the same platform. Data ethics informs the equitable and critical gathering, use, and application of data. It is the navigation of the spaces between society and regulation. It supports the foundational ethics maxim, do no harm, all the while remaining technologically positive. So those definitions saying pretty much the same thing, maybe with different nuance, gives you an overview of what the field is about and kind of the direction it might take in any given setting, whether it's corporate, industry, or government. But what is ethics? After reading those definitions, as good as they sound, you're probably still thinking, okay, well, ethics, I know ethics, it just means to be a good person, it means to be moral, etc., right? Yes and no. The thing about ethics is it's often wrongly confused with morals. And it's also often wrongly confused with compliance. Now, both from my point of view, my academic stance on ethics is that ethics is in the middle of morals and compliance. So, for instance, morals is right and wrong. There are rules that you're taught as a kid to get along in society. You don't ever have to think about morals, really. They're just right and wrong. You know them. You either follow them or you don't, right? So morals coming from the root word more, just common mores, right? Common ways of being in society. Whereas ethics is often the opposite of that. It's based on the critical thinking that bridges that gray area between social mores and then legislation. So coming out of, your upbringing, you start to ask questions. Why should I, assume that I should obey my mother and father? Maybe in some cases I shouldn't, right? It's a personal commitment to trying to understand and unpack good choices. And so that's the difference. One doesn't have to engage or think about. The other, one has to engage with at a very personal level. And so from my point of view, that's where ethics is. And of course, as we'll go into in a moment, that goes the other direction into wrongly being confused with compliance. So some of the major, I guess, points of access or concerns that a data ethicist or an information ethicist concerns themselves with are the very typical common engagements most of us have had in some form or the other with technology and society. So surveillance, right? This is a big issue. Always has been, becoming more and more so. The big issue there is not so much that we are being surveyed, but it's the gap between the expectations that we have of what surveillance achieves and what our privacy should be in a digital age. Aggregation is a big one. It's basically the idea of the ability now with technology and especially AI to combine multiple sources that may or may not refer to us or have information about us. And despite being anonymized, having all of these sources being anonymized, put together without even having your name, they can still re-identify. They can point out a certain demographic group all the way down to an individual simply by context. And so in the era of big data and now AI, we do have to very much be concerned with kind of the bigger picture of combining and aggregating different sources of information and data. So disclosure is a pretty simple one. It's often kind of the platform at a level that we deal with information when we're talking about freedom of access and privacy and different law enforcement groups concern themselves with this idea of the transfer of personal information from an authority to a third party, or sometimes the public. And the health system also is kind of the big one there, right? Now, exposure is different from disclosure, and I think it's important to understand the difference. Disclosure is something that should be done responsibly and is always done. It's out there. We don't have a lot of privacy over our information. There's a lot of transfer of our information between different authority and different bodies, and for the most part, it's done responsibly. What exposure is a case where disclosure actually results in a psychological harm to an individual or a group, and that can be done intentionally or unintentionally. And so it's a separate concern that one has to be concerned about when dealing with information. That information is not neutral. In fact, some information philosophers will say that you are your information. Your information is you. And as high level or non-applicable as that may sound, as we go further and further into biometrics specifically, you do start to realize the logic behind that. And so disclosure is something that an ethicist in the information field needs to really camp down on and try to figure out, what are the nuances there. Accessibility, this is probably the one you guys are closest to as records professionals and librarian backgrounds and whatnot. This is the right, the ability, and the know-how to access, retrieve, and then use digital sources. And I say digital sources rather than information sources because it's an interesting question to wonder now if there are any kind of analog sources that we deal with anymore. And depending on the context, one might realize that we don't really speak in terms of anything that isn't digital now. So just some food for thought. So with accessibility, you've got issues of the digital divide. Now, the digital divide is a concern that's always kind of led the field of information ethics, but over the years, it evolves into different concerns. And one of the big ones right now that I'm dealing with, being an ethicist working in a municipal government, is the digital divide amongst employees, amongst you and your colleagues working in a corporation. And that's simply because depending on your expertise, you're going to have less than or more access to emerging technologies. As an example, the big one right now with the City of Edmonton, where I work, is we want access to a responsible and safe AI platform. We have had a license with Google as our enterprise partner for many years, and so it only makes sense that we go with Google in terms of achieving our enterprise AI, and so we took on Google Gemini, right? That's Google's AI, and originally, we could only afford as a corporation to purchase so many licenses to access Google, and so decisions were made. Okay, who's most likely to need it, to use it, et cetera, et cetera. So cybersecurity, obvious. Data analytics, they get licenses, and so on, to the exclusion of other groups in the city who are deemed not as priority in terms of having access. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that it favors certain groups then becoming more informed, having further access to more abilities, to be proficient and to be to advance in their work and so on. And this kind of divide can ultimately create a bit of friction, right? Bad morale amongst employees and so on. Now, in our case with Gemini, as much as we had started to work out the standards and so forth on how we were going to, have these licenses partitioned out, Google actually just surprised us one day and said, you all have access, all your employees for free, part of the license. So it was like what do you say it, saving face. We had a bunch of, problematic considerations that we simply were able to brush away, and realizing now that because all employees have access to Gemini, we can all advance and move forward together and communicate using these newer tools. Privacy and confidentiality. This has always been a concern in any field, not just information, but of course, grounded in information. The FOIP office, the Corporate and Access Privacy Office here in Alberta, deals with kind of the partition of access to information to the public who requests it, and then privacy for individuals or groups, and works towards the balance between that. Now, with information ethics, or as an ethicist, we deal with privacy and confidentiality too, but it's more at a personal level, and more of a kind of a social level, looking to see what expectations are in terms of privacy and confidentiality, looking to see where those concerns and issues maybe start to evolve or change. And so they kind of move beyond issues of identity protection. We deal with changing cultural sentiments around disclosure and exposure. And particularly this comes into play with subcultures. So minority groups, we all have actually different cultural expectations coming from our own background, not even necessarily, in terms of what's the word? Well, cultural origins, just simply subcultural origins, our own family, our own community, our own city, Edmonton expectations of Edmonton citizens as opposed to Calgary citizens. There's subtle differences in communities, and these differences become not so subtle when you're dealing with social groups that have come from many different situations and settings. It's important to understand what the expectations are that people have around privacy. Do they even have concerns of privacy at all? So it's not a one-all catch-all type of deal. And so we look at informing kind of the best practices of the shifting perceptions, both in terms of your public self and your private self. And this is a big thing that I'm not going to go into detail in this presentation, but it does get down into kind of the ethics of being and so forth. But as I said, different cultures put on different values onto privacy and so forth, right? You may even notice traveling or going different places, or even here at home, some people have a lot of personal space expectations, right? Whereas you might be sitting somewhere and people will, sit in really close with you, right? And you think, well, why wouldn't you, give yourself some space? Well, no, they don't have that same expectation or background, and so it differs for sure. And so all of these different expectations and protections need to be balanced with the benefits that we can give to society in terms of having access to information, of not allowing so much privacy. And this sounds absurd, but I've given a few presentations lately to different police and law enforcement groups whose main concern is that they can't do their job because of privacy laws, that privacy actually interferes a little too much with them being able to keep a community safe. And so you can see, depending on which side of the fence you're on, different approaches apply. Just to give you a case of ethics theories and investigations, so, I just mentioned law enforcement. There's a theory that we refer to as the noble cause corruption theory. This is the inevitable corruption that results from consistently justifying the means with the end. So if you're familiar with ethics, you might recognize this as being consequentialist or utilitarian ethics, right? So for law enforcement, you need to do your job. You need to catch the bad guy. How you do that is not always as important as getting to that end. And so, yeah, police will often and have often used tools and methods where the public, outcry and say, well, that's beyond, that's too much invasion of privacy and so forth. Whereas from their perspective, no, this is a necessary approach because we need to, find that bad guy. So that's kind of the utilitarian or the consequentialist approach. And I'll get into that maybe a little bit later on. The mosaic theory, another theory used, or I guess important to understanding, proper investigations and so forth. It's a collection of personal identifiers that, even though they're public, even though they're available for anybody, in a certain context, in a certain collection, in a certain platform, they can expose, an individual, especially over time down the line. So this is kind of a subtle theory that not just law enforcement, but we all have to consider when we just grab information off the internet. This is a big thing with social media, right? There's sometimes pushback on police doing their job simply from browsing social media and putting two and two together, right? I mean, that information is there for anyone to see anytime, but depending on how that information is gathered and used, has different effects. Transparency is another huge issue in the field of information ethics, in computer ethics, and now especially in frontline, so government and industry. We weren't so concerned about transparency when it wasn't foundational to public relations, to profit, to making money, to making sure a company doesn't go under. All companies now are kind of putting out a very public outline of how they are transparent with their information, open data, and so forth, because it's a basic expectation that we have when working with any authority that they're open, that we can see why they're doing what they do and how they do it. So as a principle, transparency, when feasible, it's not always feasible, but when it is, that data subjects should have a transparent view of data processes. Basically, your information is your information, and you should be able to have a say and to be able to look into how your information is used. And this foundation is what creates a foundation of trust between authorities and public, between different parties. If law enforcement, for instance, again, is very transparent about what their intentions are and how they're getting there, we as public are going to put a lot more trust into them, as opposed to, kind of, if they work behind the curtain and so forth, then, well, maybe, public doesn't trust police enforcement as much as we might otherwise. So it's the public right to be informed when data use directly or indirectly affects them. And again, transparency needs to be balanced with protection of proprietary and security concerns, right? And so the big thing now with AI, especially the black box nature of generative AI, these companies don't really want to be transparent because it's proprietary information about how they build these, their technologies and so forth. To be able to be open and transparent about it is to lose money. And so there's kind of a balance there also with those kinds of rights. Okay, so the big one here in the field of information ethics, which most companies, most information professionals, pretty much anyone working from government all the way down to working in a cafe, bias is a concern now that's frontline with more and more advances in technology, and will only become more and more frontline as these new technologies are implemented. But there are a number of different biases that are not, so much akin to the technology itself, but rather to ourselves as individuals and, different social groups. And we don't recognize these biases. We never have. We'll always have bias. We always have had bias. But it's important to try to work out these biases, especially as we turn our technologies into automated tools, right? Because what we develop these technologies with is what they give back to us. And so when we program, when we build our apps and so forth, it's not neutral. No technology is neutral. And it wasn't so long ago I was not arguing, but presenting in my presentations to people, to technologists who still, would argue back and forth that technology is neutral. There's nothing bad or good about technology. Well, technologies themselves, because they're so intricate now and so advanced, they are biased at a very foundational level, right from programming onward, right from collection of data. And that bias is actually our bias. And so it's a reflection of who we are, which is interesting, in a lot of ways, particularly because people talk about the dangers of AI, but one of the really positive possibilities of AI is looking at our own hidden biases through the actions of our creations, basically. And so AI can be a reflection of our societies and us as individuals, and reflect back to us areas where we need to work on as humans. So with bias being any number of points of bias, whether it's discriminatory of gender, age, status, race, young, old, etc. It can be any number of points. It's important to recognize and then try to mitigate selection bias as much as possible in the field of data ethics or information ethics. What that means is when we're starting out on a project to create data sets, to train AI and so forth, or even to organize records, we have to recognize that we're choosing that data, and we're choosing that data for specific reasons. And those reasons are based on our belief systems. And ultimately, choosing the data sets that we do, we're not choosing other data sets. So some of the issues that come out of this is the importance of ensuring that data sets are accurate and complete, especially when AI is involved. And that goes beyond making sure that all the necessary data is present, but rather that the absence of other data doesn't lead to just as much bias as the data itself, if that makes sense. So you collect a whole bunch of data and it represents certain things. Well, you could have collected other data, but you chose not to, and it may have painted a different picture. So why did you not collect that data, so to speak? 4 types of bias. Confirmation bias, so that's basically working the system to say exactly what you think it should say. Interpretation bias, so facts and figures, same facts and figures for anybody, but what it means is dependent on how you interpret it and present it. Prediction bias, that's, maybe perhaps in predictive analytics and so forth. This is an issue as well. And then just information bias itself. So it's very important to have human oversight into any information process, whether it's traditional analog information or now digital information. To have human oversight is critical, and not just in terms of ethics, but even function. We wrongly attribute to AI this idea that it's intelligent in the same way that humans are intelligent. Well, no, it's a supercomputer. It's a super intelligent computer. It thinks like a computer does. Just the same as, if we were to take a normal spider and give it super intelligence somehow, it's not going to think like humans. It's going to be super intelligent as a spider and have the same intentions and all the rest of the things that a spider might have, right? So this is the same thing with when we engage with technologies and information. We need human ethical oversight of that engagement, particularly when dealing with demographics. So just as kind of a pointing case, actually, I just want to make sure, no, I didn't. I thought I might have missed something. A pointing case, if we look at big data and algorithms and AI, we can see a number of trends emerging. The evidence of bias in social mining has not only, well, it has been there, but now it's becoming more and more all the time. And so, you can find bias in big data in terms of the fact that there's so much information out there that our bias now becomes so much more apparent. There's been multiple cases of evidence of prejudice in surveillance and investigative efforts. Again, different approaches to what one considers to be ethical. Oftentimes, and I've heard this firsthand from different law enforcement officers, they jump on board new technologies and their abilities, and they want to use these technologies to the best of their ability as quickly as they can, because they know from experience that within months or a year, these new technologies are going to be so regulated that they're going to be useless. You can't use them in the most effective ways, right? So depending on your own belief system, this is either a good thing or a bad thing, but something to keep in mind that there are so many new technologies out there now. If you've ever seen movies like Minority Report's the big one, every single future sci-fi prediction in that movie is now a possibility. Through AI and face recognition and all the rest. So these tools are very helpful to the police, right? But also very potentially dangerous to human autonomy and so forth. Concern of data scope creep is an interesting concern that we've dealt with for a long time, but more so now with aggregated databases and the use of AI. So scope creep is basically this idea that you get permission to use a certain data set or certain information, certain records, either as public or as a servant or whoever else. You get permission to use it in a certain setting, right? And so this permission is fine. Maybe the individual whose information this is giving you permission. It's completely okay to use this in such and such context. However, that context can very quickly start to expand. And before you know it, that information is being accessed or used, or even the context of its use, outside of what those permissions originally kind of outlined. Now, this is a big thing with generative AI right now. Generative AI doesn't consider limits in terms of what the information it has access to can do, right? And so if you're going to enter any kind of proprietary or personal information into a generative AI tool, and you have an expectation that it's going to be used in a certain way, that expectation is misinformed, because that information is going to be used to train AI to further its knowledge and reach. And it's also going to be available to be misused in return. So an example here is it's often a fun thing at family gatherings now to pull out any type of new voice AI system and make Granny say something really racy or offensive. Just by recording two words of Grandma speaking, an AI system can then replicate her voice. And so as a party trick, you show Grandma what she's saying, and then everyone laughs, and then you get some other voices in there. Well, this is all fun, but in the background, this AI system is storing these voices and the connections that these voices have, and can ultimately be used in any number of precarious or bad actor scenarios against an individual, right? Where suddenly people are accessing your bank accounts using your voice and so on. So it's important to understand the implications of using AI, even just using it for fun. Concern of chilling effect and interference with individual and political autonomy. This is a bunch of big words that basically say that if there's more and more surveillance out there, and more likelihood of our information being used against us, we're going to self-censor. We're not going to speak freely. We're not going to practice our autonomy. We're even going to be intimidated into certain voting and particular directions based on the fear of being watched. And these can be intentional or unintentional changes of self-censorship. So you just think about yourself right now, and you go out to town to get groceries and go to the bank. You probably don't think about it, but you're aware that you're being watched by cameras and so forth. So your the way you act, the way you practice your being is going to be different than maybe you did 10 years ago when you weren't so concerned about these kinds of things. So this can play a big part in the autonomy of democracy and having your democratic rights, ability to practice democratic rights and so on. And so with that leads us into autonomy. You know, what is autonomy? Suppression or manipulation of one's agency, which basically means one's self-choice at an individual and political level is a breach of autonomy. Access to and control over data is equivalent to control over one's person. So like I said before, you are your information. And data agency is absolutely foundational to practicing democratic and political freedoms. And like I said, the chilling effect does come into play there. So as I've kind of mentioned before already, massive surveillance, GIS mapping, you know, you check into your bus route with a card, you know, and all your stops are now recorded and perhaps accessible by your insurance company, and your insurance company sees the route you take, that you happen to go to the clinic every second day. Okay, well, you know, if you're going to the cancer clinic, you know, you may not get such, you know, good insurance returns based on that kind of, again, aggregated data information, right, can work against you. So, so GIS mapping, a big thing right now. Predictive analysis and data mining. Again, where law enforcement really wants these technologies as a part of their abilities. Well, you can imagine where predictive technologies become so efficient that you have now created psychological profiles of individuals based on their information or their democratic or even their DNA, you know, forefathers going back, you know, what health issues did they have, what temperament and so on. So now you're able to predict crime, right? Again, back to the movie Minority Report. If you've never seen it, you should. The ability for police to predict who's going to commit a crime and to intervene. Well, you can see right away where this becomes problematic. But again, it's no longer science fiction, it's a possibility. And so biometrics can be used to manipulate in more ways than we know. And so if you have seen that movie Minority Report, Tom Cruise plays a character where he's walking down the street, and AI systems are, you know, monitoring his iris, his temperature. It can read his temperature, his expressions, and in being able to identify his mood is advertised. He's getting advertised to based on his current mood, and of course, then he reacts to those advertisements, which goes through a feedback loop, and then these advertising billboards change or kind of shift towards aiming at his changing emotion and his changing biometrics. So very science fiction 10 years ago, but this is all possible. You know, we have face recognition now that can access your temperature, can identify through gait and expressions and so forth. So you can see where these things come into, where these things need to have some kind of societal or government regulation. And my approach is that we're going to need societal regulation. We need education, self-education. We need to inform ourselves and you know, our corporations top down on how to deal with these technologies, right? We're not going to stop it. Cat is out of the bag. The field of information ethics, it once informed technology itself, right? So like I said, we would work with technologists while they're making an app or a device. And we would inform them on the best practices to avoid bias and so forth. Well, this is no longer productive use of our time because it's out of the bag, and there's no way to kind of regulate this. Not overall, anyways. Our focus now as information ethicists is social. Trying to educate people, trying to give them the resources to understand and interact with these technologies and so forth. So I've kind of walked through a couple times more indirectly, but just to point out specifically the difference in ethical frameworks which inform our own interaction with the way we access and use information, and also our social expectations. There is the consequentialist perspective. Again, this is where the end result of, say, an investigation is what matters, otherwise referred to as utilitarianism, which is the most good for the most amount of people. Well, that's great for the people who are included, right? But not so much for minorities, because that's not the most of. Deontological perspectives is more of a law-based or universal expectation of principles. And so that's a case where, say, again, I use law enforcement so much because they're such a front line, more than anyone else. They're so front line in dealing with these kinds of issues. But whereas one, police officer might, kind of work with the end result in mind and not concerned so much over the ways they get there, even if they're overstepping boundaries of privacy and so forth. Well, that's the consequentialist perspective. Whereas an officer kind of whose ethical foundation is based in, principles that are established, he may not catch the bad guy at the end of the day. He may not succeed, but he'll have a peaceful consciousness of mind, knowing that he used to the best of his abilities the legislation and the resources that he had, and did not overstep any boundaries that may have stretched the ethical principles of these foundations of law, right? So these duty-based or sometimes universally established, but even then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, whose principles, who established them, right? A question for another time. But yeah, sticking to the rules, sticking to the law may not always be so successful. So your personal ethics or values determine your ethical approach to collecting and using data. So this applies to us as whether we're archivists or we work in access and privacy with records, or we work with technology. Our own ethical approach is going to outline how we do our job, and it's important to become self-aware of what that ethical approach is. So another interesting point that we encounter in the field of information ethics, like I said earlier, it's that we often confuse ethics with compliance. But data ethics, or any ethics at all, is very different from compliance. So many corporations over the last 10 years have jumped on board the idea of establishing, data ethics outline principles, different AI principles to kind of guide their processes. Well, from my own perspective as a data ethicist, if you have 10 principles that are printed out on a piece of paper and hung up in the office for everybody to follow, well, those employees are simply going to follow those principles, right? They don't have to think about it or concern themselves because they're established. So they're not ethics, they're compliance and they're principles. Whereas ethics, again, like I said, it requires a personal commitment and critical thinking. Data ethics is primarily about people and social justice, not data. So you can imagine that this outline of 10 principles may not be helpful in any number of real life situations when dealing with people. And so, yeah, I've said this a few times, data ethics, like any ethics, is a personal commitment. It's not a matter of regulation. It cannot be delegated, so ethics can't be delegated. They can only be taught. And this is the big, I guess, approach that I take in my work, is teaching individuals to be critical thinking, to teach them how to think in terms of data ethics, because at the end of the day, in the situation, they're going to have to make a decision based on their own resources, not 10 principles that they have memorized. So yeah, when ethics becomes encoded in guidelines, it's no longer a personal choice, a matter of compliance. In other words, it's no longer an ethical reflection, but an enforced regulation. Sometimes when I'm working with or presenting to law enforcement or at the fraud conference, I will use this slide to wake people up if they're falling asleep, and I'll just state that as a data ethicist, I break stupid rules, and once I have their attention, I kind of lay that out from one perspective where I say, law and policy are in place so that we have common ground, so that our expectations are on board with each other. We can trust a certain social standard because we're all, working out of the same system of right and wrong. And this becomes a problem when people start to think, well, these rules and regulations, I get that they're important, but they don't apply to me. I understand I'm smarter than that, so they don't apply to me. But no, this kind of thinking is, of course, where the system falls apart. When set expectations are not met on all sides, a common society will cease to exist. But on the other hand, from a different perspective, there are many laws and many regulations that really are stupid, and they do need to be changed. And this is just history, right? I mean, you can look back at history and see advances and changes in law and so forth, because the previous establishment of law was not working, and was most quite often harmful to societies or individuals.
So Jared, can I jump in? We have Lewis Eisen on the call, and in Canada, he's one of our people that does a lot of workshops on policy development. And I know with the City of Edmonton, he's really well respected for his book on this, which is under the title of Rules. Lewis, I don't know if you're still on the call. I've kind of lost access to see who's truly here anymore. But oh yeah, Lewis is still here. So as you see this, Lewis, you're a great one that's taught me about codifying policy. And I think what if you want to jump in here and add some comment when you just heard Jared talk about this concept of people have to have an ethical integrity to just follow things. I can just imagine how complicated this is in law enforcement, Jared, with that sense of urgency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we need an answer now, and then to have to come up against a FOIP person or access to information person that says, well, hey, there's a process. But at the same point, there is exceptions for disclosure. But Lewis, as you see this slide and you hear Jared's words, what's crossing your mind? Troy, is he able to come off mute?
Yeah, I can. I can make you.
He's got microphone is available. Yeah, Lewis, this is his expertise. Yeah, there we got Lewis kind of coming up.
Okay, am I there? Good.
Yep.
Great session, Jared. One of the things that strikes me is that when we start with legal, which is the minimum, and we have ethical extensions and that we've put into policy, and then the law catches up to making what we said was ethical, legal, that especially in information management, we often stop. Whereas we should be, I think, pushing the envelope to say, well, okay, now the law's caught up here. That doesn't mean our job is done. And
exactly.
I wonder if you have any thoughts about what it means to be pushing the boundaries of ethics in this situation.
Yeah, well, so right away my thoughts go high level, because that's just how I think, and I envision that human evolution is always a progression. It's always an advancement, right? And so these things are always in motion. This is like a wave in motion, and we do need to keep up with it, right? Because if we fall back on the backside of the wave, we sink to the bottom as sediment, and we no longer are on the front line of evolution of thought and empathy and what it means to be human. And so, yes, as a process, we have our common mores, we have our law. And as you say, ethics is an extension of law on one side, and it also informs law from the backside. And each, as you say, each one takes over. So law eventually catches up to ethics, right? And moves forward. But then who's critically thinking about that law and how it should keep changing over time? Well, again, you have to start critically thinking. And so it's always a balance. It's always a partnership, where critical thinkers, ethicists, just normal average people who are able to, they're very self-aware and able to work with these things. We need those people to be active, to be on at all times, because if we don't, it's not a final product. We need them to inform the law and then report back to people, right? Kind of the intermediary type of thing. So yeah, that's how I think, but that's how I see it, as a constant movement.
Great insight. So Jared, we're kind of coming up at the end of the hour, and you've had a lot of great stuff, really.
Yeah.
And it's all new, a lot of it's new for me. And I just want to make sure if anybody has any questions to post in the chat, we could really start to take those now. You raised a lot of really good stuff. Now, one thing that you are in Edmonton, and recently the Edmonton Journal put out a story about what's called YEG wave. So they've taken our airport, YEG is Edmonton, and on Instagram is this thing where random people can post videos of others, and they're not even sure who's actually operating that particular YEG wave, but it's sort of a free-for-all of content that's just posted on a site. So there's no governance, it seems. So what's your thoughts of, we just sort of accept it and nobody even says, hey, this is actually pushing the boundaries of privacy. There's no thought of that, right? So what's your thoughts on that, Jared, as someone that lives in the community and sees that?
So I find it such an interesting point of both philosophical introspection and then on the ground, person to person, conversation. Because I read that article, and the interesting thing about it was that article was very, kind of conservative, reserved, as in this YEG wave. It has to be, it's pretty likely that it's manipulative, and because there's no, evidence to support where it's coming from, it's got to be, perhaps it's the Russians, right, using social media to influence. Well, these things happen. They do all the time. The Russians have, different government entities have very much interfered with political autonomy, especially. But the point is, with this YEG wave, nobody knows, right? So you have to base it on the content itself. With a few years ago, with the Arab Spring and so forth, it became apparent to everybody that all of our news now, most of it we get from the average person on social media who's taken a video of incident, right? So they might take a very close up, zoomed in view of a car burning and present it as this war torn horrible situation where someone else might have taken that picture, and people are walking by the burning car, going to office, going out for work. It's very civil, and it just happens to be there was an incident. Completely different interpretations, and so this is where we're at in terms of truth right now, and news, and understanding what's going on around us. But we can think back to when we had established respected news platforms, right? And well, those platforms have also always been biased. There's lots of evidence to suggest that those platforms are controlled by government. And I don't just mean out there, Russia or China, but here in Canada, the United States, that our news broadcasting is all kind of overseen and monitored. So you got to ask yourself, well, how do we determine truth then, if all evidence of any particular incident is based on perspective, based on kind of the angle, if you will? And I don't have an answer to that, but it is something to consider and to think about. My best bet, or I guess the way I approach it, is I try to find as many sources about any particular incident as I can, and then come to my own conclusion. But it's a big thing.
Great. Any more questions that are pressing on people? I know that Jared said that he was happy to take inquiries from people on specific topics that might have arisen from the presentation. Anybody
Carolyn,
else that has, go ahead.
Yeah, Carolyn posted in the QA here. There's a question. I'm familiar with a library and archivist having a professional code of ethics. Do you know if data ethics in particular is featuring in the codes of these professions and others like data science and information management? Does the codification just turn ethics into compliance standards?
So my personal view and experience is that any code of standards is good to basically, my point of view is you might as well just call it regulation, call it rules. Like if you call it an ethical standard, well, you're in my point of view, you're misguiding. Just let employees know the basis of your company or your professional expectations of how they act, and leave it at that. So, but there's a really interesting, I guess, historical words are filling me, but incident, I guess, or situation in library ethics, where, or sorry, no, in librarianship, where the ethical foundation or platform of the profession of librarianship is that you provide access, that you help the patron find the information they need, that they require. And this is kind of how, as a professional, you you present yourself ethically. However, as an individual working as a librarian, you may have conflict with this professional ethics, and your personal ethics may be completely opposite. And so the example I talk about was the example given, I can't remember now if it was real or not, but you know, this young man comes into the library and asks for books on how to build a bomb, you know, and starts to give evidence that he's you know, up to no good, nefarious. Now, this is posed, I think, as a thought experiment to you know, teaching people in the information professions. What do you do if your professional maxim, your ethical standard is to provide information no matter what, to resist censorship, right, to provide banned books? You know, it's funny, librarians, we often think of librarians as, you know, quiet and, you know, what kind of, you know, in the background. They're actually some of the most fiery, dangerous people I've ever met. They are advocates. Librarians are advocates. They get involved with you know, people's right to access, and oftentimes, especially in the 1960s, they would get out onto the streets and advocate for the right to read banned books and so forth. They're not calm, tame people in my experience. So you can imagine this conflict as an information professional, where you know that providing certain access could cause trouble. So what do? What's your choice? Well, there's no answer. You make a choice. If you want to follow the ethics of librarianship, you provide the information. If you want to make good on your own ethics platform, you don't. So I'm sure, you know, the actual example is a lot more is better worded than I've just given it, and it gives you pause for thought. But it's an example of kind of the question posed.
Great. Well, we're running out of time, Troy, right?
Yep.
So thank you. We've had a really great turnout today. Obviously, a very interesting topic that gives us a lot to think about. And so I know that oh, I like that, Carolyn. Don't be fooled by the cardigans. It is true that there's a lot to think about from this presentation. It will be posted on the Western IM site with the IMCanadaConnect series. And maybe we're all going to start watching Minority Report if we haven't seen it already. And so thank you, Jared, for all your efforts and sharing with us this really unique topic.
Thank you.
Very much a very interesting topic to ponder. So thank you again. And thanks
Excellent.
everybody
Thank you
for
having
joining
me.
us.
Yes, thank you for joining. It was good to be here.
Anything else, Troy?
No, I think that's good, and we'll send around the links when it gets posted.
Okay, so that's a couple days.
Yeah, before it gets sent around. Yeah, it'll be posted
Okay.
on the site later today, but the links will be emailed around
Probably
later.
next week.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Troy. Good to know that time frame. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Hope to see you at the next month's IMConnect session. I know advertising will be coming out as they work away to get a program together.
Hey, thanks everybody. Bye for now.